When Jesus spoke to the thief on the cross said, "Will you remember me?" And Jesus didn't say, "Well, it depends on your prayer life or your ministry to others or your fellowship or whether you've been converted." He just said, "Yes." And so I've carried yes with me for 40-odd years. Not if, but yes. And the yes of God is enormously valuable to people.
Adrian Plass, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
The Sacred Diaries of Adrian Plass were a huge success, was a million seller also in Germany. How do you explain this gigantic success?
Well, one of the reasons it succeeded in Germany is because the managing director of the publisher wrote an article criticizing it very heavily and saying that it was salacious and shouldn't be read, which was highly successful in getting it publicized, I have to say. But I think in Germany, it was interesting because people said to me, this is not racist, it's what they said, Germans don't laugh at anything, and they laugh even less when they're Christians. And that was so demonstrably, and is so demonstrably, not true. I think the Sacred Diary hit a nerve, it hit a center point in people's experience. Maybe it's not a great book, it's a funny book, but it deals with the truth. And I think the same happened in England, that when people read about things they were thinking but not saying, it was a liberating experience. And I think it was true also in Germany, that when the main character in the book talks about his troubles and his weaknesses and his ridiculous way of dealing with things, they were able to say, "But that's me, that's what happens to me." And I remember a young man, I read a bit of the Sacred Diary in England, and he came up to me afterwards and said, "It's quite funny." So I said, "Oh, good." He said, "But I don't think it should be read by non-Christians." So I said, "Oh, why is that?" He said, "Well, they might think that we're really like that." Well, we are really like that, but the muddle is the thing. Christianity, living as a Christian, is a muddle. It has wonderful highs and terrible lows and everything in between. And I think the diary, the Sacred Diary, helped to get people to believe it was okay to be who they are. And if there's one response I've had over the years more than any other, it is thank you for helping me to believe it's okay to be me. And that doesn't mean you don't get better, but as a great American writer once said, God loves you exactly as you are, and far too much to leave you as you are. And that's the center point of everything I've ever done, that the arms go round you, but they don't edit you. And if something needs to change, that's God's business, not ours.
Perhaps for the 2 or 3 people in Germany who do not know the Sacred Diaries of Adrian Plass, it is a sort of satire on the evangelical subculture. Is that right?
I think that's probably fair, yeah. It actually, I think, goes a bit wider than that. It depends, because, for instance, the Anglican Church in Great Britain has its own evangelical subculture. But yes, that is true. And it's not a good idea to be too rude about the evangelical subculture, because those who leave it always want to go back to it, even if they have said, "I can't stand it anymore." There's still an itch, still a yearning in them to get that back, because it's about the immanence and the intimacy and the ordinariness of relationship with God, and you don't find that in many other areas. So it may have a lot of things wrong with it, but there's one diamond in the center of it, and that is the belief that God is here and He's interested in us and all that other stuff. But it certainly needed taking apart, because it was ridiculous, utterly ridiculous.
So you wrote the book in the mid-80s. It came out in Germany beginning of the 90s. What did the evangelical scene, the evangelical subculture look like then? Was it any different from today's?
Unfortunately, generation after generation reconstruct the problems that the last one had in the church. They always have done, and they always will. I think there wasn't as much laughter then. I think people were surprised to find how much they were able to laugh. In fact, there was a big festival called Spring Harvest in England, there still is. And when the book came out, I've never experienced this since, and I never will again. But as I walked past the chalets, the little houses where people lived at night, I could hear them laughing as they read this book. And it was the most extraordinary experience, because somehow it touched where they were. And there was so much fear around, fear of doing something wrong. There's a bit in the diary where somebody says, we all looked at our elder to see if we agreed that it was funny. And there is a lot of that about, that you check out how you're responding to find out if the rules allow it. And in fact, of course, there are no rules of that kind. And things like raising your hands in the air had acquired almost a spiritual status, which is nonsense. So yeah, there are a lot of really unpleasant restrictions which were disguised as rules, and necessary rules of God, which again is utterly nonsense. But
do you have any further examples for that?
Yes, I think the tone of voice used was one. In the early days, I was quite nervous about this, but I would go to a meeting and I would pretend to be a speaker, and I would say, "Hi, it's great to be here. I think we're going to have a mighty blessing here tonight, and I'd like you to just turn to the person next to you. Just turn to the person next to you, just right where you are, and just exchange clothes. There's no need for embarrassment. We're all Christian brothers and sisters. Just take them off and pass them over." Well, when I did that, people's eyes actually revolved, I think, like they do in cartoons, where they go round and round and round, because everybody was worried that that was actually an intrinsic part of being a Christian, that you talked in that strange way. Well, why would you? And prayer, I mean, strange ways of praying we use. I mean, when I was a teenager and I heard these crescendo merchants, you know what I mean? They get more and more intense as they go up in their prayer, say, "Lord," until they're about to burst. And the younger ones are sitting there thinking, I'm never going to be able to pray like that. And yet, Jesus said, who was a bit saner than most of his followers, said, "Go into your room, shut the door, and talk to your Father who sees what is done in secret, and your Father will reward you." So sane and so gentle. There's nothing wrong with any kind of praying if it's from the heart. We've seen every kind of praying there is, my wife and I, because we travel so much. But if you're doing it to impress, or you're doing it to impress God, even worse, give him a good laugh, I suppose, it's a waste of energy, really.
So the situation you wrote, the Sacred Diaries, in mid-80s was a situation of crisis. You were caught in a depression. How did that feel, and how did the writing help you to get out of the situation?
It was fundamentally a stress illness, which was caused by 2 or 3 things, really. One was my rather patchy personality, which was cobbled together with bits and pieces and was not very authentic. And working with children who were in trouble, which was very intense and very enjoyable, but very difficult.
This was what you did?
That was my job at the time. And also the church, which was driving me mad because of the gap between what was supposed to happen and what actually happens, which is constantly being filled with rubbish in order to make people think everything's all right. We are almost neurotically positive about God. And God is not neurotically positive about God, because God is a realist. And at that time, you know, people would say, well, the Bible says, you know, if you go to the elders, they'll pray for you if you're sick and you'll be healed. Well, we weren't. Maybe some were, but most weren't. And when somebody tried to say, but I wasn't, or they weren't, people would come up with a list of reasons why you weren't healed. It's easy to do that, but it's not right and it's not true. And it was beginning to really, really upset me. So if you put those three things together, I think I kind of abdicated from responsibility, which was quite fun for a day, but then it got quite serious. And I was going to actually write a very serious book about how angry I was, and my wife, among others, said, no, write a funny book, because no one will read an angry book, which is absolutely true. So I wrote the Sacred Diary. It began as a column in England, and then it became a book. And there was absolutely no intention of having a ministry. I never ever thought this will help people or this will do something. All it was doing was taking the dirty water, as we put it in England, off my chest and putting it out there.
How did the Christians around you react when you said, I'm depressive, I got this sickness, really?
They were not very happy. The people in my church were not very happy, because at that time people were very worried about depression and psychological illness. And in fact, we went to Australia a couple of years after that. And after our first talk in Australia, there was a queue of men, all of whom wanted to talk about the fact that they had experienced either depression or stress or something else, but they'd never been allowed to talk about it in church. And I think there was a problem then with that. So I do understand that. People get very nervous. I mean, Christians get very nervous. They hardly believe it anyway, what they say they believe. You know, we say we believe. In the middle of the night, we're all either poets or babies. You know, we're either inspired or we're crying because we're lost and we need cuddling. That's where Christians are. And to try and fit them into a framework that is firm and secure and solid and easy to handle is a waste of time, because that's not what happens. So I think people were disturbed by the fact that I'd apparently gone off the straight and narrow and wanted me back safe.
What did really help you to get over this depression? What would you say?
My family, my wife, my children, my friends, some friends who were very good. They didn't lecture me or quote Bible verses at me or any of those other things. They were just there. And writing. Writing was enormously helpful.
So your denominational background is that you were raised as a Roman Catholic, and you once said, I'm paraphrasing, that you don't get the Catholic out of the Catholic once it's there. How did?
No, there's some truth in that, I think. You've done your homework, haven't you?
I did.
Yeah, I think that's gone now, really. I was raised as a Catholic, but it was in the days when the Mass was in Latin. So it was really an hour of torture, sitting for an hour listening to somebody speaking Latin. Is not my idea of a good time. And I think I said in one of my books, the only thing I enjoyed was when everyone stuck their tongues out to have the wafer put on them, and I thought that was good. Comparing the thickness of tongues, I think it's probably one of the most useful things I did spiritually in those days. I am not dissing. I'm not disrespecting Catholicism. I have some great friends who are Catholics, and I don't even think in that distinction anymore. But my experience as a child, that's how that was. You know.
Are there anyway some small elements of Catholic life in the Adrian Plass of today?
Well, I suffer from guilt.
Catholic guilt?
No, well, possibly there's an element of that in it, but most people I meet suffer from some form of guilt, so I don't really know. I think because my father was so anxious we should be Catholics, there's probably a residue of guilt somewhere in there, but I don't think that's very strong anymore. No.
God didn't play an important role in your life as an adolescent, that's what I understood, but you went to church then afterwards to, I read, to hunt girls.
Yes, I did.
But indeed you found God. How did that come about?
To hunt girls.
That's what I read.
No, I know. It just sounds strange, put as vividly as that. I was, like most teenage boys, interested in girls, and I was looking for girls, yeah. And I went to an Anglican youth club, and there were girls there, but they reacted to me rather oddly. there was a sort of benevolent, a benevolently predatory feel to the girls. They obviously were praying for me, which would have made me vomit if I had known it at the time. I didn't want them to pray for me. I wanted them to lust after me, which was extremely unlikely, but that's what I was hoping for. And then I sort of became a Christian at that time. I no longer quite know what that means, but that began in that church at that time. Yeah.
You once said this was not so much as a conversion, but the beginning of a way you were traveling. Could you explain that distinction?
Well, there was a lot of talk at that time, and there still is, of course, in some church circles, and I understand it, about a moment of conversion, a time when you commit your life to Christ or you ask Jesus into your life. And I was in a church where you would talk about that, and so I think I assumed that I had done that. I had performed some act that meant everything should change. The fact that it didn't seem terribly relevant, really, because there's always an answer, isn't there? You know, well, your faith wasn't great enough, or you've got to trust God. And I mean, you know, you get weary with all these sound bites in the end. What it did was the most important thing was that I heard an evangelist say that when Jesus spoke to the thief on the cross said, "Will you remember me?" And Jesus didn't say, "Well, it depends on your prayer life or your ministry to others or your fellowship or whether you've been converted." He just said, "Yes." And so I've carried yes with me for 40-odd years. Not if, but yes. And the yes of God is enormously valuable to people. And my wife and I work very hard to reflect the yes of God, which sometimes means listening to things that you don't agree with and not jumping in. I remember meeting a lady at a counseling conference, and I said to her, "What is the most important aspect of counseling for you?" She said, "For me, counseling has brought me closer to Jesus than anything else in my life." So I asked her what she meant. She said, "They listened. They didn't answer me. They didn't talk to me. They listened." I think if there is an element missing in what we do with people in the church, perhaps it's exactly that. That we don't trot out our personal prejudices or ideas or weights or biases, but we simply listen and believe there is a God who really is here, even now, in this studio, is here, who can change anything at any moment, and I haven't the faintest idea how he will do that. He might change you, Daniel, this morning, if it's still the morning. If it's the afternoon, he might have to switch to PM. But he could do something for you right now, or he could do something for me. But we don't know. And isn't that good? What a relief.
So you once said God is nice.
Yeah.
This is one very important thing for you. Is nice, is that not a very weak adjective to describe God?
Yes, isn't it? It is a weak adjective. In the 80s, we sang songs about God being awesome, wonderful, great, creator. None of us knew what we were talking about. There's a film in England, I don't know whether they've seen it in Germany, called The Railway Children. I don't know if you've ever seen that film. But it's about a family whose, their father and the wife's husband goes to jail because he's suspected of doing something wrong. And then he's released because he didn't do it, and it's wonderful. And the oldest daughter goes down to the station platform one day near her house, and a train comes in, and it stops, and it's back in Victorian days, and the steam fills the platform so she can't see anything. And as she stands there watching, the clouds part, and suddenly there's her dad with his bag, and at that point in the film, you hear on the soundtrack, "Daddy, my daddy." And what most Christians want, and a lot of non-Christians, is that. And to know that God is not just awesome and wonderful and all those other extravagant things that will mean something one day, but to know that he's the sort of father who comes running down the road when you just make a small move because he wants you back, wants you home. It's a nice God. And it may seem a pale word, but it's actually something we can embrace in our own feelings about God. And I think very important to people.
You wrote a lot of books,
Yeah.
and your latest book is called The Shadow Doctor. It's not as funny as The Sacred Diaries, I suppose. Tell us something about the book.
Well, it's really completing a circle, because the Sacred Diary was about, it featured a character, the main character, who didn't really know what he was talking about and was joining in with what was going on and hoping it was all okay, which was a bit of a reflection of me as a young Christian, certainly. I mean, I was terrible. I was preaching to people. I think I wrote somewhere else that it was like being in love. You defend your loved one, even though you don't know anything about her, and you tell lies if necessary. It doesn't matter. And in the end, you can end up with a very hollow ministry, because all you're doing is defending a God you don't know, and just hoping you get it right enough to draw people in. Well, the young character in this book, Jack, he is in that situation where his ministry has become meaningless, because although he's got a reputation for helping people, actually, he's not receiving anything, and it's beginning to kill him. And he gets involved with this man called the Shadow Doctor, who is very mysterious, has a past that is difficult to understand. He needs somebody because he's not accountable to anybody. Jack needs somebody because he's falling apart. So they need each other. So they work together, begin to work together. And the book is about that coming together, and some of the encounters they have with people in the course of doing that. And it ends with even more mystery. And there's actually another book coming which will follow that, which will explain some of that mystery.
You'll celebrate your 70th birthday in 2018.
Yeah.
Apart from the sequel of The Shadow Doctor, will there be any new projects in the coming year, and what will the party be like?
There's always a project. We were in Hungary this year, and those who know Hungary will know that they've suffered, since the end of the Second World War, decades of oppression and lies. And we were there last year speaking at a young people's conference. And I shall never forget, after the conference, a young girl came along with a translator and said through the translator, "I want to say something to you." And we said, "Yeah, go ahead." And she said, "I want to thank you for telling the truth about what it's really like to be a Christian." So we're going back to Hungary next year. I'm not quite sure what we'll do, but we'll do something there. So that's a project. We'll continue to talk to groups of people and try and find out what on earth to do next, not really sure. The party had better be a good one, and it had better not be organised by me, that's all I can say. I think our 4 children will do something. Actually, I know they're planning something, because they think they're not heard when they talk about it, but they are, so there is something going on. So I think it will be pretty good. Of course I'll be dead, won't I? The Bible says we only live till 70, doesn't it?
70 or 80.
70.
So
or 80, is it?
I think so.
Oh, right. Well, maybe I won't die when I'm 70 then. I'm not planning to. No, I'm looking forward to it. Be good.
Great. So we wish you all the best for your upcoming projects, and God's blessing, and thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much.